Welcome to the course of Leadership and Motivation Techniques. This is your specialization course of Human Resource Management, and it is one of the very interesting subject for you to learn. It comprises of so many different eras, different developments, different criticisms, and yet it is an emerging area. It will not be a course similar to what you studied in your undergraduate level. It is an advanced level, and you will go through this subject in depth. That is why we would start our today's first lecture with the leadership past, present, and future. In this chapter, I will give you an overview of what leadership is, what leadership is not. Might be some things or the basics are repeated, and then the different school of thoughts we are going to discuss in this chapter. Moving forward, we would continue to go into in-depth analysis of those school of thoughts and what they believe the leadership is all about. So, bear with me for this lecture, and I hope that by the end it would be a fruitful lesson learned for everyone. To start with, we would initiate our discussion with what leadership is, not in the ordinary way where we define leadership in simple ABC components. We would go in a bit of detail. Leadership is an influence relationship among leaders and followers who intends real changes and outcomes that reflect their shared purpose. Now, this is an ordinary definition of leadership which focuses mainly on the components which are that the leadership is an influence relationship. That means it influences the relationship between who? Between the leaders and followers. And why it influence the relationship? Because the leader as well as followers intend what? Real changes and outcomes that will reflect their shared purpose. So basically it indicates that the leadership role is uh, emerging because of the shared purpose of leaders and followers, and that is why the leadership is a characteristic or a component which influence this relationship between leader and follower. Now, leadership is a formal and informal contextuality. It is not just a formal one. It can be informal as well, right? So formal and informal both. By informal, we mean that anyone can play a leadership role, while by formal, we mean that somebody has been designated to be a leader. And it is contextually rooted and goal influencing process that occurs between the leader and followers, group of followers, or institution. Thus, the science of leadership is a systematic study of this process and its outcomes. So, leadership is not an attribute or component which is merely reflected on the leader's part. It is rather more critical in this component because it is a process, and along with the process it has certain outcomes, as well as how this process depends on the leader's trait and behavior, which means that the process and outcome can be influenced by or can be determined or dependent on the leader's trait and behavior. Moreover, it can also be an observer influence, and the leader's characteristics and observer attributes made regarding the outcomes of the entity led. So, leadership is basically a relationship which influences the relationship between the leaders and followers, which where the intention is outcome related, and they share the common purpose. And it can be formal as well as informal relationship where there is a process and it is for the sake of some shared purpose which is reflected in the outcome. It may be because of the traits and behavior of the leader which may influence this relationship. It can be the observer's influence as well, the characteristics of the leader, and the observer attributions made regarding the outcomes of the entity led. By entity led, we mean the organization, the team, or the group which is led by that specific leader. So, leadership is all about this. But there is a point that you need to understand, that these definitions or elaborations are not mutually agreed, or there is no universal definition in this regard. And when we talk about there is no proper definition, elaboration in this regard, it is because that it is believed that the more there are psychologists, so the more they will be giving different definitions and point of view. And I have not seen any other subject or area in which there are so many school of thoughts or paradoxes as it is in the leadership. So that is why it is ever emerging and evolving area where the scholars, the academicians, psychologists, behavioral scientists, they are not mutually agreed upon any single definition of leadership. Vroom, one of the major motivational person whose contribution in towards the motivational theories has been highly regarded, he has his own point of view regarding the leadership. He believes that there are few problems of interest to behavioral scientists with as much apparent relevance to the problem of the society as the study of leadership. The effective functioning of social system to countries is assumed to be dependent on the quality of their leadership. This assumption is reflected in our tendency to blame a football coach for a losing season, or the credit or to credit a journal for a military victory. The critical importance of executive functions and of those who carry them out to the survival and effectiveness of the organization cannot be denied. Now, over here, he believes in that behavioral scientists are very much interested in the leadership from the different perspective, because there are so many different attributes attached to it. So, for example, if a football team has lost the season, they didn't do well, then we blame the coach for it. And for the sake that whenever an army wins a war, we give credit to the general of that time. And similarly, so many examples are there, but it is not just an executive function that we have to understand. We have to understand the effectiveness of the organization as well, how good that organization was and how good the team was in this regard. So this reflects that leadership is not power and it is not management as well. When we talk about power, power refers to the means leaders potentially have to influence others, and can be defined as having the discretion and the means of asymmetrically enforce one's will over entities. Now, power is something which a leader may require, but it is not necessary that without power there is no leader. Yes, of course, power is a source through which a leader can influence others, but it is not necessary. And when we talk about the power over here, you have to take the examples of referent power, that is the follower's identification with the leader. This means that if someone is in the good position on the managerial role or who has the authority, the followers believe that this is a leader, which is actually not. That is referent power, for instance. Then expertise, the ability to reward and punish performance, and the formal power that is accorded legitimately based on one's role. Now, sometimes we believe that a person who is in a position to reward you or in a position to punish you is basically a leader, but actually he is not a leader. That is something which is related to the power. Leadership is separate phenomena which has nothing to do with the power in this regard. And thus, the ability to lead others towards some goal and get them to exert costly efforts towards centralizing the goals required, that one has power. Whether one has formal authority or not does not matter, though by having formal authority one attributes power ex officio. This indicates that it is good if the leader has the power, but it is not necessary. Although we regard those people with power as compared to those leaders who are without power. When we come towards the second component, management, often confused with the leader or leadership, management is a task driven, resulting in stability grounded in rationality, bureaucratic means, and fulfillment of the contractual obligation, that is, the transition or performing your roles, duties, and responsibility. So, this is somewhat management, and by management, we mean managing things effectively and efficiently. Some view leaders and managers are different sort of individuals. Yes, probably that can be. A manager can be a leader can be a manager, and it is not necessary as well. Other argues that successful leadership also requires successful management, that leadership and management are complementary, but that leader goes beyond management and that leadership is necessary for outcomes that exceeds expectation. So sometimes these are written rules. Managers are given the leader's role, but sometimes it is not the case. So a manager and leader can be one person, and a manager and leader can be different person. There are the differences between the leaders and management. I hope that you have already gone through these different characteristics. Basically, we derive management role and leadership role on the same components, that is direction, alignment, relationship, personal qualities, and outcomes. When we talk about management, so the management role or direction is planning and budgeting, keeping eye on the bottom line, getting the results, and so on. The leadership role in giving direction is creating vision and strategy and keep eye on the horizon. That is being a visionary person, going beyond the bottom line. When we talk about alignment, organization and staffing, direction and controlling, creating boundaries, these are the managerial tasks. But when we refer to, while leadership has a different role, they create shared culture and values, they do helping others grow, and they reduce the boundaries. When you talk about relationships, so management focuses on objects, that is producing, selling goods and services based on position, power, and acting as a boss. Whereas the leadership, their focus is on people, inspiring and motivating followers. That is why this course is all about leadership and motivation techniques based on a personal power, acting as a coach, facilitator, and servant, not as a boss. Personal qualities are required for a management is emotional distance, keeping yourself distant from your subordinates, expert mind, talking, conformity, and insight into organization. However, leaders' personal qualities vary from the management and they are emotionally connected. That means their heart is connected to their subordinates. They are open minded, mean their mindfulness is required. They are very good listeners. They communicate. They are non-conformatory. That means they are encouraging people, and insight into self-character is what required. Finally, the outcome of management is maintain stability, create culture of efficiency, while leadership focuses on creating change and culture of integrity. So I hope that by now you would be pretty much clear about the differences between management and leadership. Why do we need leadership? We need leadership because on a supervisory level and on a strategic level as well. On a supervisory level, leadership is required to complement organizational system and resolve complex tasks and social problems. That is why we need leadership. It means that organizational system cannot be run or successfully only on management and power. Rather, it requires certain people in a leadership role who can support the organizational systems and who can resolve the social problems in this regard. That is on the supervisory level, because all the time you cannot use the carrot and stick or enforce people to do the task. Rather, you may need people to get involved with each other, with their organizational staff, and make them motivated so that they can achieve the desired goal. On a strategic level, leadership is required to direct and guide organizational and human resource towards the strategic objective of the organization and ensure that organizational functions are aligned with the external environment. Now, this is very important that you need a person to lead, because previously we discussed this thing that leadership requires to have a eye on the horizon, and it means that the person should be visionary. So you need a person to lead and direct the organization as a whole. And that is very much required to at the strategic level, that is on the top level. When you have a proper for people with the right vision and the right mission, and they know what they want to achieve, what they have planned for the organization to excel in the future. For so these people are very important. They are the people who constantly keep eye on the external environment, and it is necessary to ensure the coordination function of the organization as interact with the dynamic external environment, because every time now and then we are seeing that the nature of the organizations are require tremendous change. That is the radical change they are anticipating, because in the external environment there are constantly changing taking place, and the competition in the external environment demands you to be on your toes all the time and push yourself for constant change. For the organization to adopt to this context, leader must monitor the external and internal environment, and they will be based on those internal and external factors. They will keep an eye on the organizational strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats, and then they would be in a position to better place themselves in a right path to get advantage of the external opportunities, play with the strengths of the organization, and overcome the weaknesses of the organization. So that is why leadership plays a tremendous role in an organization. Now, leadership and motivational elements we already discussed. Now, you would have your minds already set on this notion that leadership is pretty much important component for motivation of the employees, as well as taking organization beyond the horizon and making sure that you have a prospective future related to the organization. So some of the elements of leadership are oftentimes equated to management, making the lines between leadership and management rather blurry to some. After all, leadership is not about leading the organization, but leading of organization. That means that manager's task is leading an organization, and the leader's task is leading of organization. That means that the managers will do whatever their job description asks them to do, whatever their roles are defined and focusing on to do. So their task is leading in organization, whereas the role of leader is leading of organization, right? Of course, some aspects of task oriented influence have motivational elements and can be called leadership. Also, having task oriented expertise must predicts vision communication to ensure that the right vision is chosen. Thus, leadership and management are two sides of the coin, and its currency can only have value if leader has power. So this was the summary of what we discussed till now. The leader has to play a leading role in the to lead the organization towards a better future, whereas the manager's role is to play his role in particular manner where they can make sure that everything is done in a proper manner. Now we will go towards a brief history of leadership research, and we will discuss the different school of thoughts. These are the school of thought uh, which also depicts the entire story of leadership, its evolution, and the different stages from which it has been evolved. So, if you look into this component on the left side, you would see the nine names which reflects the nine school of thoughts. And on the horizontal, you would see the years or the era mentioned, which will guide you that in which region or in which era these school of thoughts were emerged or introduced. And then you would also notice the three different bars for very active, and which era this was very active, moderately active, and generally remained inactive. So this will give you a very a good insight of the historical development of leadership. So one of the most common and oldest school of thought is the trade school of thought. If you can see, it can be traced back to 1990s, that is the early 20th century. And in the beginning, initial stages, it was not that active. Then, from 1920 to 1950, the trade approach or leadership style was very active till 1950, and then suddenly you can see it got inactive for almost 2 decades, then partially or moderate active in the 80s, and since 80s it has regained its grounds and it is once again active in these days. The second school of thought is behavioral, and it was introduced somewhere in the 1930s or 1940s. Um, in the beginning, as it was initial stage, so it was inactive. Then it got active while the be a trait school was getting faded, and it remained active for almost 2 decades. and then it became relatively inactive from 1970, and it is faded out and it is not active these days. So almost been for 50 years, behavioral uh, school of thought is inactive. Then the contingency school of thought emerged in uh, 1960s. It remained pretty much active in 70s and 80s, and afterwards, since 2010, it has faded and it is not active. The fourth school of thought was contextual, and it almost similar time at the same time as of the contingency school of thought, it was emerged, and if you can see, it has gained very much attention and it is active right now as well. Then the skeptics school of thought emerged in 1970s. However, just right after 2 decades, it became inactive. The sixth school of thought was relational school of thought. It emerged at the same time as of the skeptic school of thought in the 1970s, and it is still very active in the area of research. Then new leadership emerged at the same time in 1970s, and since then it has been an area of great interest of the researchers, and it is still very much active. Then informational processing was introduced in the 1980s around, and it is very active. One of the most recent school of thought is biological or evolutional school of thought, which was introduced in almost 2010, and it is an emerging area of research as well as an interest of scholars throughout the world. Now, these nine school of thoughts will give you a brief insight of which school of thoughts have emerged historically in which era and what is their current status. If you look into it, the behavioral school of thought is no more of interest to any researchers or psychologists, for instance. Similar is the case with the contingency and skeptical. Other than that, the remaining six school of thoughts are active for research and learning as well. Now, from the next slide onward, we will just try to cover up the brief understanding of what these school of thoughts are all about. And from next chapter and onward, we will go for in-depth analysis of each school of thought. So for a while, first we would just try to cover up what these school of thoughts basic fundamental elements are. So, first of all, we will start with the trade school of leadership. The trade school, one of the oldest, that was the scientist studies leadership, began at the time of the 20th century, as we discussed in the previous slide as well, and with a great man or trade-based perspective, which saw the shaping of history through the lens of exceptional individuals and the people who were considered those people with the appropriate or the designated traits were considered to be the elites, and they were considered to be the great man. And over here, they did nothing more or much rather than just showing what traits a leader should possess. So, this school of thought suggested that certain dispositional characteristics means something very special characteristics, that is, the leader should be having a stable personality, his attributes or traits should be appropriate one, and they can be differentiated from the leaders and non-leaders. So they focus on some of the particular traits which they identified that these are the traits which a leader should have. And commonly, what we study in the research or discuss in the research related to the leadership, we often discuss these traits that leader should have or possess these attributes or these traits. Thus, the leadership researchers focused on identifying robust individual differences in personality traits that were thought to be associated with the effective leader. And those traits were considered to be the something that everyone was looking into for a leadership. The traits of intelligence was strongly correlated with the perception of leadership, and that it and this effect was robust across the study. So when we discussed stable personality, some of the traits of the personality, and then we are now discussing that intelligence was something which was associated initially with the leader. A strong relationship of big five personality factors. You already studied it in some of your other courses. Big five personality model, you can search on Google and you can see those components are commonly associated with the leaders emergence and their effectiveness. The big five personality traits or characteristics include openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So these were the attributes which often the researchers have identified to be associated with a great leader or a person who has these traits in him or her was admired to be a great leader. Now, if you simply go to Google Scholar and search for leaders research or leadership research, you will often find these components pretty much common. And even till now, these attributes or traits are part of the research. The second school of thought, which emerged right after the trade school of thought, was related to behavioral school of leadership. They believed that their common element was based on, and which you often refer to as the type of leaders which they distinguish as democratic or autocratic leader. This research began in the 1950s and they focused on the behavioral style of the leaders rather than the trait attributes of a leader. This line of research focused on behavior that leader enacted and how they treated their followers. So you can correlate it clearly with the components that when a person has the autocratic leadership style, or how they are going to treat the others, and when a person has a democratic leadership style, how they are going to uh, treat their subordinates. Studied identified two overarching leadership factors generally referred to as consideration, that is, being supportive or not, a person oriented leadership or opposite to it, and initiating structure, which is directive person or task oriented leadership. In this regard, there was consistent evidences of a universally preferred leadership style across tasks or situations. So some people still argue that the democratic leadership style is better or the autocratic one is better, but there is no conformity to it, and it depends because both have been successful simultaneously and both have failed to give appropriate results. So we cannot be justified in this regard. From these inconsistent findings, researchers suggested that the success of leaders' behavioral style must be contingent with onto the situation. So rather than stating or posing that the democratic style of leadership is better or the autocratic behavior of a leader is better. It is now obvious that it depends upon the situation in which these styles are implemented, and implementing the right style or right behavior in as needed by the situation will pose or provide result rather than focusing or sticking to one type of leadership. Research on behavioral theories of leadership is declining, and as we have seen in the model as well, that since 1980s there has been tremendous downfall, and it has been pretty much inactive area or school of research. However, many of the ideas of behavioral movement have been incorporated into other perspectives of leaders. That is, it has become a part of the contingency theories, and it has been transformed into the transformational leadership as well. Consequently, interest in an initiating structure, or what is also called instrumental leadership, has again on the increase. So we cannot say that all in all this school of leadership has diminished. It has not diminished. Rather, we can say that it has shifted uh, and become a part of the other schools of leadership, rather than focusing merely on the behavioral attributes. But these attributes of behavioral school of leadership has been adopted by the other schools. The third one is contingency school of leadership. The leadership contingency theory movement has been taken part in defining the leadership, and one of the major role was from the scientist Fielder in 1960s and 70s. Pardon me. Leader member relationship was what his focus was mainly on in this contingency theory. They believe that it is all about leader member relationship. Second, they focused on task structure, that the relationship depends upon how the tasks are being structured, and the position power of leader to determine the effectiveness of type of leadership exercised. If you focus on it and look closely into it, these are the three fundamental components of any relationship between the boss and subordinate, or between the leader and the follower. Leader member relations are very much important, since uh, the first school of thought, traits wise, behavior school of thought also focused on it. And now this is the third one which is focusing on. And then the task structure. If the tasks are independent, then there is no much role of leader required. But if the tasks are interrelated and dependent on each other, then the role of a leader is very much important. And thirdly, the position power of the leader will determine how the leader has been given authorities to make decisions. So it matters a lot. House in 1975, who focused on the leader's role in clarifying paths for the follower's goal. Follower will always look towards the leader to clarify what goals the follower has to meet, or what milestone they are supposed to reach. So for that, it is very important that the leader role is very important. Kerr and Jermier 1978 extended this line of research further into the substitutes for leadership theory by focusing on the conditions where leadership is unnecessary as a result of factors such as follower capabilities, clear organizational system, and routine procedures. Now, We all agree on this point of contingency school of leadership, that contingency theory plays a very key role in defining the role of leadership and organization. But initially, the Fiedler introduced this point that leader-member relationship will define the importance of leader, then the task structure will define it, and then the power the leader has will define the need and role of leader in an organization. Then House clearly stated that the leader's role in clarifying the goals the subordinates are supposed to achieve is very important. Finally, in 1978, Kerr and Jeremy clearly stated or contributed further towards the contingency school of leadership by introducing a concept of substitute for leadership. And they focus on different conditions. Their conditions were that every organization may not require active role of leaders or leadership role, and it is contingent on such conditions. For example, if the organization has if a leader has a very good followership, and that means that their followers are fully equipped, they know what to do, they have the experience, they have the knowledge, they have the skills, they have the abilities, they know how the tasks are supposed to be done, they are having their specializations and expertise in that area, then the leader role become unnecessary in this regard. Second, clear organizational system. When the organization systems are very clearly defined, goals, roles, tasks, SOPs, policies, procedures, way of doing things, everything is clearly identified, then there is no need of a leader, or the leader's role become pretty much unnecessary. Finally, routine procedures. When everyone is doing the same thing again and again on the daily basis, and there is no differences in their tasks or their actions, so there is no need for a leader to play an active role in organization. So these aspects of contingent school now included in contextual approach towards the leadership. So we moved forward from contingency school of leadership towards the contextual approach of leadership, which is basically defining the context in which the leadership will be required. So that is another school of contextual school of leadership. This perspective has its root initially into the cross-cultural psychology. So it is rooted from or introduced from the psychological perspective. This perspective covers a broader range of issues regarding how contextual factors like now these are the contextual factors which will define the role of leadership and organization. For example, leaders hierarchical level, the leader at the bottom will have less power, will have to make sure that operational activities are achieved on a regular basis. His task would be more related to motivating the people to get the job done on time with efficiency and effectiveness. But the more you go up on the ladder to the middle level and to the top management and so on, the contextual or the context of leadership differs or varies. So at the top, there would be a strategic level leadership would be required, and at the bottom, there would be operational related leadership role required. So both of these components are different from each other. That is why we have to understand and clarify this thing that the leader's hierarchical level and the role of leader varies from context to context. Second, national culture. Now, in certain national cultures, every person requires them to be led, and some people prefer not to be led, but they want to explore by themselves. So this is a natural component where the national culture may give you a different viewpoint. Leader follower gender also matters. This is something interesting, and it has also gained much attention very recently, that it depends that whether your leader and followers are from the same gender or from the opposite gender. So it is something from the psychology of the individuals, that how they treat it, so there may be a different context associated with it. Then organizational characteristics, crisis, among other factors, etc., can also be contextual factors. Understanding the contextual factor in which leadership is embedded is necessary for advancing a more general understanding of leadership. So that is why this is one of the key and hot topics of research in this time. And being an HR student, you need to understand the context in which the leadership is being studied or it has been implemented. Leadership does not occur in a vacuum, that you need to understand. For leadership, there has to be a leader and follower and a proper system. Maybe it is a formal or can be informal as well. Leadership is always rooted contextually, as we described it in the previous slide, and its boundaries must be made explicit so that its nature is better understood. So you have to understand the boundaries in which the leader role has been studied. Doing so, is what makes theories more powerful and useful. Now, going towards the relational school of leadership, it was emerged in the 1970s, and the relationship between leader and follower began generating substantial attention, and it was merely because of the theory LMX. This movement was based on what originally was termed vertical dyad linkage theory, evolved into a leader member exchange theory, LMX theory. It was introduced in 1995. What does leader member exchange theory states? It describes the nature of relation between leader and their followers. For example, high quality relation between leader and its followers are based on trust, mutual respect, whereas low quality of relations between the leader and the followers are based on fulfillment of contractual obligations. So this theory infers that leadership, or the relationship between leader and follower, is dependent on whether they are from the in group or the out group. When the follower and leader accept each other from the heart, and their relationship is purely based on the trust and mutual respect for each other from inside, that is why we call it in group. That means they have accepted each other from inside, as compared to those where this relationship is not truly built from the heart. Rather, it is just because one way or other they both are performing their task just because they have to complete their duties and responsibilities. So that means they have the contractual obligation. One has to lead and one has to follow, and that's it, nothing more personal into it. Important to note that the quality of leader and follower relation refers to affective and attitudinal outcomes. LMX is not a style of leadership, but a dependent variable that is driven by some processes at multiple level of analysis, whether due to the leader, the followers and organizational level, or the context, etc. So these are some of the components where we say that the leadership is dependent on different components. So when we are talking about leader member exchange relationship and the quality of this relationship, so we are basically trying to analyze this relationship on the basis of uh, factors, uh, from the leader's perspective, from the follower's perspective, from the organizational perspective, or in the context in which this leadership is taking place. These aspects of leadership are important to study in their own right. Leader-member exchange theory suggests that high-quality relation generate more positive leader outcome than a low-quality relation which has been supported empirically. So that means that we have to create a leader member exchange quality. We have to create some high components, high outcomes, because if they are in group relationships are built, then it is going to be very fruitful for the organization as well as for the individual. This line of research continues to find new directions, and overall interest of the different approaches to the leadership relatively appears to be strong. So, if you are interested in learning one of the attribute which is still an area of interest for the organizations, it can be an LMX theory. And then we come towards Skeptics of Leadership School, which has emerged and died very soon. Uh, it emerges emerged as an evolution which was required to cope up or meet the challenges of 1970s and 80s. Uh, the background of this school of leadership was that there was doubts in the validity of the questionnaires or the data which was collected in the field of leadership, where they believe that this data or the questionnaires are biased, and they are for based on the implicit leadership theories, where they've just simply calculate the scores of the leaders, and based on that scores they say this leadership style or this leadership trait is important and this one is not important. And they what they did was to they simply criticized the approaches of the basic or previous theories of leadership. This position suggested that what leaders do, that is leadership, is largely attributed to the performance outcomes and may also reflect the implicit leadership theories that individual carry in their heads. So it is not necessary that always we state this thing that if the leader XYZ trait of a leader is providing a high results, that this one is good. The other school of thought says that XYZ leadership style is not giving appropriate results, so this leadership style is bad. So it can be something in the mind of the person, but reality is not like that. We discussed it previously as well that leadership styles are now situational, and the results may vary. One may give you instant result and some might give you results in the longer run. So observers contribute towards this area by stating that the attribute leadership as a way of explaining observed results, even if those results were due to factors outside the leader's control. Sometimes the results, because the questionnaires cannot give you appropriate result, as this was the stance of skeptics of leadership school, and they were right in this regard as well, because control factors, everything cannot be controlled because maybe the organization was not good, maybe the processes were not good, maybe the external factors were the reason, maybe the national culture was the reason, maybe some characteristics of the followers was the reason, and so on. There would be so many things which will attribute, and we might believe that it is just because of the leader, but these factors were not in the leader's hand and not in his or her domain. So these cannot be the reasons for saying that this leadership style has failed and this one is successful. These evolutions were made by observers in the process of understanding and assessing causes to organizational outcomes. So, what leaders do might be largely irrelevant given to the performance outcome. This means that it's not necessary that leaders or leadership is always the reason for the outcome. So leaders group or organization affects how leaders are rated. Leadership was an attribute made to an individual based on how well their respective units perform. This might not be a valid reason. Research doubted whether leadership existed at all or was even needed, thus questioning whether it was any difference to the organizational performance, whether we should keep leaders, we should create leaders or not. So it was a doubt. Interest in the skeptic's perspective was diminished, although there is an increasing research in followers' role in leadership process. That is what exactly I just narrated in the previous slide and explained as well, that it is not always the leader, it can be follower or the context, internal or external environment and so on. So we need to understand this. So many of the questions posed by the skeptic school, the study of leadership has benefited from. For example, the first one, using more rigorous methodologies. We need to change the methodology. Merely a questionnaire was not enough. B, differentiating top level leadership from the supervisory leadership, because the essence or nature of leadership may differ and give you different results. And C, finally, focusing on followers and how they perceive the reality. That is also an important contribution. Although this school of thought is no more, the skeptics school of leaders is playing no more role, but the questions they posed or rose give birth to the various school of thought. So the study of followership and the resultant information processing perspective of leadership has generated many theoretical advances that have strengthened the leadership field immensely. Let us discuss and see those schools what they say. Information processing school of relationship. Information processing. Keep this word in mind because this clearly states what the skeptics stated and what they are going to say. The major imputes of the information process perspective is based on the work of Lord and colleagues. These are the people who contributed a lot in developing this school of thought. The focus of work has mostly been on understanding how and why a leader is legitimized. That means why the role of leader is important. Through the process of matching his or personal characteristics, that is, the traits, with the prototypical expectations that the followers have for the leader. So if you focus on what they believe in, are basically these attributes. The focus of work has mostly been on understanding how the leader is legitimized. That means what they did was, first they tried to learn that whether the leader is required or not. Uh, and they tried to find out the legitimacy of a leader by by focusing on the personal characteristics of the leader, right? This was one of the area, that mean their personality traits. And then expectations of the followers have been also taken into consideration while trying to identify whether the leaders are legitimate and they are needed or not. So The information processing perspective has also been extended to better understanding how cognition is related to the enactment of various behaviors. So they try to understand. This properly indicates this thing that information processing perspective is based on the cognition or the cognitive attributes, that is the mental capabilities of enactment of various behavior, that whether the people will enforce various behaviors in all the situations or in one specific condition. Research in the area of cognition, information processing, and emotion should continue to provide us with the novel understanding of the leadership. So it is not just the cognition, that is the mentality of the people. It is also the information processing. Information processing mean how people process the information. So it is something psychological in the perspective, and the emotions. But with the emotional state of both the followers and the leaders should continue to provide us with the novel understanding of the leadership. So this is one of the area of the interest as. Now we move towards the new leadership school, where you might have heard, and it's very famous phrases nowadays: a charismatic leader and the transformational leader and the visionary leader. This is something the new leadership school has emerged with these concepts. The motivation of this movement was based on the House theory of charismatic leadership, which inspired the work of Boss and Burns, 1978, and so on. They argued that the then paradigm of leadership were mainly transactional. So everything was in the transactional component, and they found they were focused on the mutual satisfaction of the transaction, that is the social exchange theory, which we discussed previously. Boss believed that the different forms of leadership was required to account for followers' outcome centered on the sense of purpose and the idealized mission, that is mean transformational leadership. And transformational leadership is idealized and inspiring leaders behaviors include followers to transcend their interest for that of the greater good. So this school of thought has introduced charisma into the leadership, visionariness into the leadership, and transformational characteristics into the leadership. Transformational and charismatic and other models characterized under the heading of they are all called new charismatic approaches currently make up a single most dominant leadership paradigm and also hold the top spot in terms of the publishing articles in the premier journal. So why this has gained much attention? Because if you remember previously we discussed that the things are kept on evolving, and we are in the area where we are still understanding and learning about the leadership, about the different attributes of the leadership. So it is very much important to understand and know this thing, that it is still evolving, the leadership concept, and we are still in the learning phases. And as we discussed in the very first slide, that as long as there are psychologists alive, or the behavioral scientists there, this area or domain will still evolve, and it is not going to die as soon as anyone can expect. And one of the reason that we are now all of a sudden recently where the scientists or the scholars have moved into another school of leadership, where their focus has turned back towards the realities of humans, and this school is known as biological and evolutionary school. Now the biological stance or the psychologist stance has moved ironically to one of the oldest branches of science, biology and evolution. And they believe that it's a new thing, but it is not a new thing. It is the building block or the old block of leadership studies. But it has emerged recently, and recently a lot of research is also taking place on the biological and evolutionary school. This perspective is rooted in the hard science by directly measuring observable individual differences. That is, it believes in that the leadership may vary on the basis of the biological variables or processes. It can also consider the ultimate as opposed to the proximal components, cause of adaptive behavior versus evolutionary process. So they have taken all the biological components into consideration while evaluating the leadership. This research stream is novel and is currently producing interesting findings, including, for instance, the heritability of leadership emergence is one of the area, the leadership role occupancy another area, identifying the specific genes associated with the leader emergence, that is another area. So it's all open to you to learn and to understand where and how you are going to relate and correlate the evolutionary perspective and the biological perspective with the leader. Other interesting avenues including studying the effect of hormones on correlates of the leaders and leaders' outcome, neuroscientific perspective of leadership, general evolution point of view of leadership, and effect of physical appearance on leaders' outcome. So all these components come into hand in this regard. The color of eye can be one of the thing. The left-handed versus right-handed personalities, leaders' outcomes. Uh, Gender we already discussed in the previous schools as well. So these avenues are right open. We discussed all the nine school of thoughts, and I believe that these nine school of thoughts will help you in understanding the leadership process. And let us just summarize what leaders need is influence, intention, personal responsibility, change, shared purpose, and followers. That is what leadership needs and a leader involves in. And finally, the new reality for leadership. What that new reality is that we need to learn in this course. Thank you very much for listening. Please do give your feedback on the topics or the overview. We will discuss in the coming lectures all these schools of thoughts and the evolution and then correlating it with the motivation and motivational techniques. Until then, thank you very much. See you later. Bye bye.